Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LEC week number 3 overview and analysis video in the summer split. We are over the halfway point in terms of the regular season already because this is such a small, group kind of format here where you only play each team in your own group once in a single round robin. It goes by pretty darn quick to get to that top 8 to eliminate our first 2 teams, and honestly, by the end of this video, we might already know one of the 2 teams that is eliminated, that is done and not going to be going to the playoffs here for the summer split. So a lot on the line already for these rosters. I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comment section below. What did you expect from this week of action, and did all of the series live up to your expectations? Were you surprised by any of the outcomes? Are there any upsets that you want to talk about? Of course, I'm going to be excited to go over a couple of series in particular in today's video, but always curious to know where you guys land down in the comment section below. But without further ado, let's get into things. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We'll be updating my power rankings from number 1 to number 10 at the end of the video as well, kind of talking about where I think teams are landing in terms of their expectations. But as you know, most of today will be spent talking about the games we got themselves. So let's get into day number 1. We have, I guess, our pseudo super week here. It goes back and forth between 6 series and 4 series. Last week we got the shorter one. This time we get the longer one with 3 days to talk about. So kicking off day number 1 was a matchup between Movistar, Koi, and Navi, where Movistar, Koi are going to pick up the 2-0. This is expected in terms of what you thought the 2 rosters would do, and honestly, kind of the way that we got there was expected, but maybe not like the exact specifics, if that makes sense. I think the 2-0, it makes sense, and even the competitive 2-0, that's very Koi, is to look bad in your wins. Even though you're winning, it's a very Movistar Koi thing to do throughout this year, where this team has just been laughably inconsistent in terms of being at any given time the best team in the LEC, and at other times not even in the top 3, just in terms of how their production goes. But Navi, not the kind of team that can actually capitalize on Koi really making a lot of mistakes, even if game 2 was pretty close, and honestly, even if there was some really good performances out of a couple of individual players. So let's get into it. Player of the series for this first series here for me is going to go to Elyoya, although I do think it is kind of up in the air. It's really up to you who you want to give player of the series to. I don't think it was quite as obvious as dud of the series was on the other side, but this was more of a team effort, I would say, than just one player really stepping up. But Elyoya getting it makes a lot of sense. Thought he was really good at playing active and fast and shutting down the enemy jungler on the other side in Thager, who did not play particularly well. Again, we will talk about that a bit more moving forward, but I think most of this just comes down to the fact that Pantheon is a really good champion that can do basically anything you need him to do at any point throughout a game. And, that's what makes the Game 2 draft quite interesting to talk about. I'm not one to talk about draft all that much. I'm a big draft guy. I like to analyze drafts, but in a way where, almost every single draft has a win condition, has a way to play, and has a way to win. At some point, though, you just have to be like, okay, it's Game 2 in Fearless, and you're on red side, and you're getting Rumble, Pantheon, Taliyah, Nico, like 4 of the best champions in the entire game. It just feels like a lot of the resources were allocated quite poorly in terms of these drafts from Navi, leaving up way too many options for Koi in that second game, and they took full advantage of it. Elyoya really pressuring the map on this Pantheon and really being able to control a lot of the space in a lot of these team fights. Look at the close quarters problems that can be created by Movistar's draft in game number 2. You have so many different ways to be able to punish missed positions coming in from Navi, and I think that's exactly what Elyoya in particular was capable of doing. Of course, you do want to give major shoutouts to the bot lane. Supa and Alvaro, I think, continue to be really big positives. Supa only dying once throughout both of these games combined is very impressive. Sometimes I wish he was a bit more aggressive in terms of how he played this, but especially on the Corki in game number 2, you don't really want to be the liability. It's okay to be more aggressive on something like Kai'Sa, especially with the build around game 1, but you were pretty far ahead, and I think you could play out game 1. Game 2, you really want to make sure you're in a decent spot on the Corki. You do not want to make a mistake that can get capitalized on by a Wukong, or even eat like a Jace Shock Blast. You need to make sure that you are always in a spot where you can stay safe, and I thought Supa did that at least relatively well, and the damage was there. Alvaro was much more greedy and aggressive in terms of the way he was looking for these engages, but he kind of had to be, especially by the end of that second game on the Nico. Being able to get that big pop blossom off was huge for Koi. Jojo, once again, very aggro, very involved in everything that this team basically did. I think he was the one that was really connecting everything together. He had the highest KP on the entire team, which is very, very abnormal for a mid laner, and so you do want to give him credit for that, but at the same time, there were some times where it just felt like he was getting outplayed by Larson, who had a great series on the other side, which we will definitely talk about. Mirwin was also relevant, I would say, on the Rumble in particular. overall, like, I think Koi played well as a unit. I think they played their front to backs well, but there are some small things that I think you could hope to see them improve upon. And for Na'Vi on the other side, as much as I'd like to sit here and say, like, oh, I was right for saying that they were going to be bad, which I kind of am, and I'm kind of right in a couple of specific areas, but there are a couple players on this team that I thought were really good in this series. Really, it was just one. It was Larson in the mid lane, who played fantastic here for Na'Vi. There were a couple of fights that he just mega outplayed. The Akali in game number 1 was very relevant, the only piece that was even trying to keep them in that game. And the Rise actively delayed Koi's ability to win the game. And really, Larson had the chance to 1v5 at the end of game number 2. So I do want to give him a lot of credit, because I do think he's received a lot of criticism over his time in the LEC the past couple of years. And a lot of it's deserved. But even as I've said on this channel, I think a lot of it isn't. And I think, part of it is just that his team has been really bad. Rogue was really bad this year and last year. He didn't really have a lot of pieces around him that could make him relevant. And, his style didn't necessarily, lend itself to being the best player on a team. I think that's been the case for Na'Vi as well. And I honestly think he's been fine across this year so far, especially here in summer. This was a really great showing. And I think it goes back to, okay, well, his team's bad. How much is he actually able to accomplish? Sam D was fine. I think that there were a couple of moments where it was like, all right, I wish he would do a bit more, but overall he wasn't making egregious mistakes, which I think is generally fine. I'm still a bit lower on him. I would say much lower than public sentiment is. I think he tends to be a fan favorite from his time in the LFL. I don't have that kind of biased personal connection to him, and so it's hard for me to see it in the same way. I just think he's one of the weaker AD carries in the LEC, but, hopefully he can eventually prove me wrong with a better surrounding core. Malrang is just not a particularly good support. In fact, he's looked pretty tragic in that role so far. Adam couldn't really show up here today. I think part of that is him, and I think part of that is just overall the game state. It's hard to take over on the top side, but he's also not, locked in right now. I think that that's abundantly clear. And I think part of that is Thager, who is the obvious choice for dead of the series. He completely ran game number 1 on the Zyra. It wasn't even remotely, competent from him. I think he got absolutely blasted. The Jungle Canyon in that game in particular was massive, but the Wukong wasn't better in game number 2. You can look at a couple of Cyclones, but everybody basically played well in game 2. And I think his Zyra, really dragging down the team in game number 1 really made this unwinnable. So unfortunately for Thager, he's already kind of been, a task to be replaced going into next year, because they've already signed Rylek as their starting jungler for 2026, and now he's just kind of hoping to play for a job on a different team. Unfortunately, with this kind of result and with the way that he's played in his limited opportunities so far, it's probably not going to happen. But overall, Navi's still one of the bottom teams, and quite frankly, they're playing for their lives in the upcoming week here. If they go 0-3, it could be a really bad spot for them. And for Koi on the other side, they're still one of the better teams in the league. They're always going to be inherently inconsistent with the way that they play and how aggressive they can end up being. And I'd love to see them a bit better at executing in the mid game, but, picking up a 2-0 win, it's hard to be too critical of them here. Then moving on to our second series of day number 1, and this is a very important one in terms of how the standings break down. It was Team Heretics taking on SK Gaming, and SK Gaming is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. I thought this team for sure was going to go winless here in the summer split. I thought they were by far the worst roster here in the LEC, but they pull out a pretty massive victory here, and that's because Team Heretics is now staring down the barrel of being 0-3 in the LEC, of being the team that's the most in danger of missing out on the playoffs. And I just didn't think that that would happen after how they played in this spring split. Like, this summer has been a nightmare for them in terms of, just the regression that we're seeing from this team. I think perhaps the LEC has gotten a bit more confident. Perhaps there was a bit of a reality check in terms of how things went internationally, but whatever the case, Team Heretics has not been able to keep up. So let's go ahead and talk about it. For SK, player of the series is going to go to Skeens in the jungle. How could it possibly go to anybody else? What a series overall from Skeens. He was really great from start to finish. Honestly, a fantastic facilitator, somebody who was pushing the tempo forward in both of their wins. First on the Nocturne in game number 1, a very aggressive dive, like oriented comp in game number 1, not just the Nocturne Orianna to be able to combo off of that, but also the Aurora for Din Din on the top side to really kind of push that aggressive narrative and to try and blow up a lot of the squishy carries, the double marksman plus Brand on the other side of this matchup. And then the Vi in game 3 was even better. Like, he completely obliterated Sheo in that third and final game, just in terms of the aggressiveness that he was capable of showing. He was diving in, followed on top by the Galio, and then it was very difficult to really take him down. He initiated almost everything that happened for SK throughout this entire series, and you know what? SK looks like geniuses right now. for, selling Bukata, who's on BDS and kind of struggling. And, they got a bunch of money for him in the middle of the season, and they go bring in Skeens, who everybody looks like, is maybe not going to be a particularly good player with his time in the TCL, not looking so good at the start of this year. And here he is playing arguably better than Bukata is right now. So it just is a very funny kind of turn of events. But Skeens looking great in one of his first few series back here in the LEC. I don't think it's just him, though. I want to give Kadui quite a bit of credit as well. This still is a Jinx comp in game number 3, as much as we want to talk about the setup coming in from Skeens and even Abadaga, which we will get to. Kadui still had to make the most of it in terms of the damage he was capable of doing. It's hyper carry versus hyper carry with the Jinx versus Aphelios in the bot lane, and he was just better. Kadui was just a lot more active in terms of being able to capitalize on the setup, even if Flakked wasn't really all that bad in game 3. Probably his best game of the series because everything else was a bit of a nightmare for him, but the Jinx was certainly more effective. Loopy, I think, was generally fine. Stick this guy on Lulu duty almost every game. Give him any reason not to have to do anything in terms of playmaking. It's no shocker that he lost the only game in this series where he had to play a playmaker in the Bard. He's just not very good at really anything, but especially in that role. Abadaga's KDA looks terrible. Part of that is real. The Taliyah game in game 2 was absolutely disgusting. He got mega gapped by arguably the worst mid laner in the entire league in Kamalu, and the Orianna in game 1, quite frankly, wasn't all that impressive either. Skeens was doing a majority of the work on the Nocturne, and then you had Kadui on the Sivir being able to follow up, but he ends up coming up clutch for SK when they need him the most, because all he has to do is press R on Galio during the engages, and as it turns out, everything ends up working out with Galio. All you have to do is protect the Jinx, and, again, it worked. So, credit to Abadaga. Even if he was kind of terrible in terms of his raw mechanical execution throughout this series, he did what he needed to do in order to win. Din was there as well. I don't really have a lot of positive or negative things to say about him. He had a couple of really nice fights, but was overall, fine, I guess, generally speaking. SK, in general, I just didn't expect this team to pick up any wins. I thought they were the worst team in the league by far. That looks like it might be Na'Vi at this point, which is unfortunate, but SK looking a lot better than I anticipated, and Team Heretics looking a lot worse than I expected. Really, there is no reason for this team to be performing like this, especially the two veteran players that had really been stabilizing and carrying this team throughout a majority of this year. Sheo and Flakked, I just do not think played well in this series. There's almost nothing else left to say on that front. Whoever you want to give dead of the series to out of those two, it should go to one of those two. I'm giving it to Sheo because I think it was more noticeable that Skeens was the better jungler here today, and I think that's where I end up knocking points off of Sheo, specifically on Brand in game number 1, where you need to be very aggressive and you need to make sure this Nocturne doesn't get out of control. Didn't happen. And Poppy in game 3, this is an Omega Poppy comp, and yet somehow you weren't relevant enough to be able to salvage the game. It's frustrating. It's a very slow, very methodical experience that Sheo just wasn't able to keep up in, but I think it's fair to call out Flakked as well. If he was worse in game 3, perhaps I would blame him a bit more, but he was terrible in game 1. I don't think he was really all that great in game 2. They kind of won off of Kamalu's Yone in the mid lane. And the Aphelios, while he wasn't the problem in game 3, he certainly wasn't the solution either. You basically draft an entire comp around Aphelios, and again, it just doesn't really work out. So Flakked, Sheo just not stepping up here today when they needed to, and I think everybody else was generally fine. I think Kamalu was really good in the first half of this series. The Rise, not so much in game number 3, but again, kind of difficult to operate when the game is so slow-paced and they just have a Protect the Jinx comp that they're executing better. You have Stend, who I thought was really good throughout this series, especially on the Rakan in game 2. Carlson wasn't great, but he was just whatever on the top side. It really did come down to the veterans stepping up versus not stepping up, and the fact that they couldn't is why they lost this series. So definitely a bit frustrating for Heretics, and like I said, they're staring down the barrel of 0-3 and, being in the worst possible spot to try and make playoffs. If this team goes out in the bottom 2 after overachieving in the spring split, that's going to feel like such a step backwards. And then for SK Gaming, this is massive. The fact that you're not even bottom 1 right now in the LEC is already such an accomplishment. If this team can actively make playoffs, that's going to be one of the biggest surprises that I can remember in terms of roster construction, but I am a little bit excited for them. It feels like a lot of people counted them out. They definitely are the underdog. We'll see if they can live up to that status. Then moving on now to day number 2, our middle day of the week here in the LEC, and kicking off day 2 was a matchup between Team Vitality and Na'Vi that Vitality is going to absolutely slam. This was not even remotely close. They obliterate Na'Vi, and, I'm going to reference some things that I said last week because I think, for one, Vitality is incredibly predictable as a team in terms of what they are, and we'll talk about that a bit more later on in the week as well, but I think what this really proves is that Na'Vi is just not very good. With SK picking up a win against Team Heretics, I think I can say with pretty heavy confidence that Na'Vi is the worst team in the LEC, and I don't think that should surprise anybody. Looking at this roster, they have a lot of holes, they have a lot of things that they're not very good at, and so to see this team really struggle and to not really be able to put something together when they've only been working together for a short amount of time, not really gotten a ton of practice or scrim time, it makes a lot of sense for them to just not be there in such a small regular season. And for Vitality on the other side, while this team is still questionable in terms of their overall talent level, you want to know the most consistent thing in the entire universe, it's how Carzzy plays the week after he runs it down. And don't get it twisted, like the last time we saw Carzzy play, which wasn't last week because it was a shortened week, but the last time that we saw Carzzy play, he completely ran it down. He was actively losing games for Vitality. So you know what's going to happen in the next series, the next week? He's going to pop off. That's just how this guy operates. It's always been how Carzzy operates, and once again, it happened in this series. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Carzzy's not even player of the series. In fact, I would say that he's probably the fourth best player on the team in this series, and that's not a negative to him. It's just how well everybody else ended up playing for Vitality. But player of the series for me is going to go to Fleshy in the support position. This was an amazing series from him as a primary creator for the team. You know, I think the fair way to put it would be 1 foot in, 1 foot out on a player like Fleshy coming into the split, where I think I was really high on his time in the LFL. I thought he looked really, really good there, and I really did feel like he was an LEC caliber player, but Vitality had really struggled to find any sort of consistency in this position, and I'm still frustrated at this team for getting rid of Hylissang at the beginning of the year. I still think they would be in a better spot with Hylissang here as the starting support than especially Nisqy and obviously Fleshy coming in here. But if Fleshy is going to genuinely start to live up to some hype and potential that we had for him, which I want to make it clear has not always been guaranteed for a lot of these top tier prospects to come out of the ERLs. Look at, players like Paris coming out of the ERL this year, where it's just not really been there so far in the LEC. If Fleshy actually is going to be a player that can come in and be good for this team, then yeah, I'm really excited about what the outlook for them looks like, and that's exactly what he was in this series. He ended up being a primary creator, a really aggressive engager on both, the Rakan, which is a playmaking type of engaged champion, and then the Alistar, who's a lot more straightforward as that engaged tank that really wants to kind of hold the line on the front line. Fleshy was really good in both of those roles, and I do think he ended up looking pretty fantastic throughout this series. There are a lot of arguments on who should get player of the series, but for me, it's going to go to the support. The other player that I really considered was Linsauce in the jungle. Obviously, the funny clip coming out of this series that everybody's going to be referencing is the payphone one, and that is hilarious. It's one of the funniest clips I've seen in a professional game in a very long time, and should just go to show how dominant they were in game number 2 with that shutout type of game against Na'Vi. But it's still really, really impressive coming in from Linsauce to actively play the way that he did. And Vhagar's not exactly the most tough of competition right now. Again, we'll talk about that, but he's really improved. I think this guy's gotten a lot better over his time in the LEC. I don't think he's ever going to be a star. I'm not even sure he's ever really going to be like a world's caliber jungler. I just don't know if he has that kind of upside, but he's kind of proven himself to at the very least be LEC caliber. And I think at times that was pretty questioned. So I'm excited to see that from him. Chaya continues to be really positive as a secondary carry for this team. I really wanted to see them invest into him a bit more resource-wise going into this split. It's not happened so far. They're still picking him on things like Orianna and Annie, but he's so good in that role that it honestly doesn't matter. Carzzy goes deathless. That's always a really good sign. Like I said, Carzzy always has a revenge tour in mind when he ends up having a bad week. And then Knock was fine on the top side. The one player that didn't really stand out a ton to me, but still was very good for Vitality. When you win everywhere, when you dominate the series like this, it's hard to, pinpoint one player as being overly negative. It's just overall all positive for Vitality. And for Na'Vi, I think this locks them out. Correct me if I'm wrong from a mathematical standpoint, but I believe this locks them into the 5th spot at 0-3. Sorry, Na'Vi. This is just, it's not very good. This team wasn't good. I feel pretty good about my preseason prediction, saying that they were not going to be a team that ended up making it out of groups. Obviously, it felt like I was a lot lower on Na'Vi than a lot of the comments in that video told me I was, and I think it's just kind of been proven correct here. They just don't have the talent to be able to compete at the LEC level with what they put together. I think some of these pieces should stay. Adam is good, and it's hard to really kind of see that because the team is a disaster right now, but I think that there are clear members of the team that aren't good enough to be able to move forward with, and key among them is Vhagar in the jungle. Again, I know that he's not coming back next year. It's already been announced that Rylek will be this team's starting jungler, but he might be the 4th best jungler in this organization signed to Na'Vi right now. You have Malrang starting in the support position. You've got Yankos as a co-streamer and Rylek coming in next year. I don't think Vhagar's better than any of those players, and so it's really frustrating to see him him, I guess get a lot of opportunity when it just really kind of came out of nowhere to me that he was brought up for Navi in the first place. I know people were higher on him, but I was always lower on him. Go check out my, pre-summer, I guess, power rankings video. I think it explains a lot better than I can now, but just overall, he played to expectation, which is unfortunate because we expected very little of him. I think Larson had a much worse series here than he did earlier on in the week, although I am willing to give Larson at least a little bit of grace because he was the only player who did anything in that previous series. Malrang is not a support. Get this guy out of this position. He's actually genuinely terrible at playing support. And Sam D, once again, Han Sam D, just not the player that I think everybody wanted him to be. He's not really going to be able to compete with any LEC AD carry that steps up on the day. So for Navi, they're the worst team in the league, and I think they would improve that here. For Vitality, they might be a little bit better than I'm giving them credit for, especially with a team like Heretics not looking so good. This could very easily be top 6 or top 5 in terms of how things break down. They've underperformed in the past, but we know this org has the talent to be able to make it work. This is only their first series of the week, though. We'll see how they progress moving forward. Then moving on now to our second series of day number 2, and you already knew the outcome of this one the moment they started hyping up that both of these teams are undefeated, they're both looking so good. The moment you start to feel excited about this rivalry, it comes crashing down again. It's Fnatic versus G2, and of course G2 ends up slamming them. This is what happens every single time. It feels like Fnatic is finally starting to figure out who they are in terms of, their roster construction, the way they play the game. Fnatic just can't hold on in terms of being able to compete against the big dogs in the big moments, and that's what G2 has proven over and over and over again when they face this team. Again, I'm not trying to say that Fnatic is terrible or anything like that, but there is nothing more predictable than me watching the pre-show and seeing them be like, this is the closest iteration of Fnatic and G2 we've had in a long time. Poby has increased Fnatic's floor by so much, and they're going to be able to do so much, and the moment that they start talking like this, the moment I know that it's not going to happen. You can't hype Fnatic up like this. It just doesn't work like that, but for G2, hype them up as much as you want. Honestly, I feel like they've fixed a lot of the problems that they had coming out of the other splits. I think the LEC is generally still pretty inconsistent and pretty weak across the board, but G2's biggest problem was that they didn't have a clear play style. They didn't really have a clear way to play the game. They either had to skill you in terms of just being able to 1v1 hands check you, or they had to be able to, push the advantage so much in the early game that it didn't really matter, that they didn't really have a clear identity of how to close things out. It does feel like they've improved in a lot of key areas. I think Skumond in particular has really gotten his feet under him, and they're looking like true powerhouses at this point. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Skumond, not my player of the series, although he was excellent. How can I not give this to Broken Blade on the top side? He was everywhere on this Rek'Sai in game number 2. He was huge on the Kled in game number 1 as well. New Kled, very fun to see that in the first game. Rek'Sai top lane, very fun to see that in the second game. There were a lot of things that I think obviously Broken Blade kind of drew headlines for, but I think his play backed it up. He did just about as well as you could ever ask him to on these champions, and he had a huge impact on the game as a whole in game number 2. I honestly think it's going a bit under the radar just how relevant he was on that second game, because I think his ability not only to dominate the 1v1 on the top side, to take out the Cassante and make that basically a worthless pick for Oscarinin on the other side, but also, again, affect the map, be able to play with Galio, be able to play with Xin Zhao, and really kind of push the tempo of the game, make it much more difficult for Fnatic to find footholds to be able to 5v5 in the back half. That was, huge. That was the reason G2 ended up having such an easy time taking that second game. So I really want to give Broken Blade a shout out because I think he played excellent in that second game, and I think he's been phenomenal ever since coming back from the EWC. I think really this split so far has kind of brought back my excitement surrounding Broken Blade, which it was sorely lacking, I think, at the beginning of the year, just in terms of how he was performing. But it's clearly not just him, it's everybody on the team that's stepping up. Skumond was phenomenal in this series. Razork has been excellent since Poby came in. It felt like those two had really great chemistry as a duo because Poby was very willing to kind of follow Razork around to get small leads individually, from his good hands and be able to translate that into, pushing Razork's advantage forward. And he was very comfortable being the one that was getting enabled because that's his best role. That did not happen here. Poby was not able to generate a lead in the mid lane, and Razork was not able to really do anything in the jungle. And a lot of that was Skumond really taking away options and really playing for his win conditions. Poby making a lot of mental errors and Skumond likely being the one to capitalize on them it's a really big deal. He had a phenomenal series and he earned the fan vote for player of the series that he got on the broadcast. Caps was infinitely better than Poby, both in and especially out of lane in this series, where Caps just continues to be an absolute menace. Again, there's a reason G2 has a track record of always being the kind of team that it doesn't really matter how much gold they're down, they're always going to be able to find a way to get back into these games, and it's because Caps is just so freaking good in that role. Hansama goes deathless. Labrav was a big, facilitator in this series. It's all just clicking for G2 right now. They kind of feel like the best team in the entire league, and you know what? That's exactly what we expected from them at the beginning of the year. We can't exactly be surprised when G2 starts to figure things out and get back into the win column. I can't remember the last year where G2 didn't win a single title. They are definitely out for a domestic revenge here in summer. And for Fnatic, they just did not have the firepower to keep up. A lot of the things that had gotten them to this point where they were undefeated ended up being their undoing in a series like this. Mostly the mid-jungle duo, which was just not good enough. Poby is the obvious choice for dud of the series. I mean, you can talk about the in-lane disadvantages he had going into caps, because I think this is really where you can start to see some of the flaws in Poby's game. I was excited coming out of last week because, yeah, you know, he beat Kamalu and Abadaga, whatever, man, but he beat Nuke last week, and Nuke, I think, is a good mid laner, but Caps is on a different playing field when it comes to the raw mechanics and his ability to generate leads in the early game, and Poby clearly not on that level quite yet because he lost in lane, and then, boy, some terrible macro plays. I think the teleports, you know, not even just one, multiple. The teleports in this series are going to be the ones that kind of stand out to a lot of people, and obviously those are terrible, but just generally Poby's map awareness was very low, I would say, throughout a lot of these games. He's been a driving force for why this team has felt like they have been better over the course of this split. That was not even remotely the case here in this series against G2. Razork got completely out-jungled by Skumon. Like I said earlier, it's really difficult for Razork to play the game when his mid laner is not fully enabling him. It's why I don't think Razork has an easy time playing internationally. Mostly because I think he just requires his mid laner to be able to donate resources to him, and if the enemy jungler spots that, he can take away resources from the mid laner so that they're not trickled down in any conceivable way. And again, if your mid laner just loses, then it becomes harder anyways. That was the problem with Humanoid, is that he was too risky in the mid lane. He would often just lose resources, and that meant Razork had a harder time playing the game. And so it ends up being the situation where Razork's win condition is so conditional, it's so specific, that it's really hard to expect him to ever actually perform like an elite level jungler. It's the reason he's never won the LEC, because I think it's really difficult for a player like this with his skill set to win the LEC. When it works, it looks phenomenal, and he's won MVPs for a reason, but man, it's tough to imagine a world where he's just ever going to be fully consistent. Oscar Renan got blasted on the top side here. I continue to believe that Oscar is overrated in terms of just what he is in the community. I think he's a top 4 or top 5 top laner in the LEC. I just don't see the top 3 hype right now. I think his laning is just too bad. He's gotten better, but top lane's already not a very strong role in the LEC, and I don't think Oscar is an exceptionally good player. Upset and Mickey were not the problem, but Mickey certainly wasn't the solution, especially on the Nico in game number 2. Upset really just didn't get to play the game. This is a pretty standard Upset kind of performance. But for Fnatic, like, I think all that's become clear here is that this team does still have a ton of major issues that they're having trouble overcoming, and this mid-jungle duo still might have a ceiling. It's all really whether or not Poby can continue to win in the mid lane. If he can start generating, you know, advantages against players like Caps, then maybe things turn around. But as it is now, G2 clearly still better than Fnatic. Fnatic still clearly have a ceiling to them in terms of what their cap can look like, and G2 very much punishing that here. But that's going to bring us to our third and final day of action here in the LEC in week number 3, and boy, did we kick off day number 3 with the fun one. It was Corp taking on Team Vitality, and Vitality is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. Recall your minds back to what I said earlier this week about Vitality. When Carzzy has a bad week, whatever he does the next time he plays is absolutely unbelievable. It is inescapable. It has been a permanent fixture. It's the reason I've always considered Carzzy a player that I cannot put in my upper tier, because in order to have a week like this, he has to have a week like he did in week number 1, but you still get the week like this, where he goes up against Corp and ends up being able to drive Vitality to a victory. Wasn't the only good player on this team. In fact, I would say everybody on Vitality had a great series, all things considered, although there are some problems with a couple of the performances. But when you're pulling off an upset like this on the best team in the league that just took down the defending champions, you deserve a lot of credit. Yet, like, a lot of the flaws start to fade into the background a bit more. For Corp, this is a pretty terrible result, and I think that there are a couple of players that I'm going to go pretty deep on in terms of just not playing well in this series and making some gigantic mistakes. But, you know, I'm not going to freak out. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Corp is all of a sudden a bottom, you know, 3 team in the league or whatever, right? Like, they're still going to be a team that threatens to win the entirety of the LEC, but that's the real threat, right? Is that this is what the best of the LEC has to offer. They're a team that on any given day can lose to basically anybody, as we saw in the playoffs, and if that's going to be a team that you expect to win the entire league, then boy, is this region in trouble. Like, let's just say it how it is. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Chayek is going to be player of the series for me. This guy had a crazy good week, and honestly, at this point, I'm starting to go all in on Chayek as a really good mid laner here. I'm not sure he's ever going to be a superstar, because I just don't know if he has that kind of mechanical upside, but boy, is he very smart and very consistent as a player. player. I really like the way that he plays the game. I think he's been good throughout the entirety of this year. And I really don't see any reason for this ever to start regressing. His playstyle is super consistent. He's really doing this on things like Orianna and Talia, and he was doing it on Annie earlier on in the week. Like these enablers that just make the rest of his team look better and make their lives a lot easier. That's what Chayek is really good at. And honestly, that is a very, very translatable skill set to great teams. If you have a mid laner like this and you're surrounding him with top tier mechanical talent that can take over games, that's the kind of situation where Chayek can become one of the most valuable mid laners in the entire league. Really, really love the way he's playing the game right now. And honestly, even from a 1v1 mechanical perspective, he's able to go toe-to-toe with a player like Vladi and be better than him in lane. He's able to go toe-to-toe with a lot of the other mid laners and be better than them. Like, it's a really good look for Chayek, who I think is very much emerging as a player to watch moving forward, as somebody that could potentially be a league winner, you know, sometime in the future. You know, I don't know if Vitality as an org is ever going to be able to get there, especially with the core that they have here, but Chayek is certainly the player to watch on Vitality, regardless of if he's taking all the headlines or not. But Carzzy and Fleshy, the other two that I think were just awesome throughout this entire week. Carzzy has another great series where, quite frankly, he just outplays Kalist, especially in terms of the mistakes that end up coming out. Kalist is the one who ends up, you know, kind of Carzzying himself in the back end of this game and just, you know, being out of position, getting caught, and losing his team the game. It's really unfortunate to see that for a player like Kalist that is typically pretty good at that stage, and obviously Carzzy's very happy to benefit from it considering just his track record as a player. But this is what happens with Carzzy, man. He has one terrible week where you watch him play and you're like, golly, this guy is not good in the slightest, and then it doesn't matter who he plays the next week, he's gonna bounce back and look like $1 million, and it happened once again here. Fleshy got player of the series earlier on in the week. He pulls out Pyke in game number 3 against K-Corp and ends up beating them on it. Really fun stuff from him. You know, I think a lot of people are talking about Knock Knocko, and trust me, I understand at least a bit where they're coming from here. I think that there were moments on the Cassante in game 3 where things looked pretty solid, on the Yorick in game 2 where, you know, things looked pretty okay. But really, I think in order to have as much hype on Knock Knocko as Reddit has, you kind of have to just blind yourself to the bad games. Like, you just kind of have to close your eyes and pretend they don't exist, and I can't really do that. Again, I've gotten some criticism in my own comment section about me being too low on Knock Knocko. I am not denying what this guy can do mechanically. I think absolutely, you look at the hands and you look at the skill set, if you get this guy in the right building with the right teammates around him, you can really enable him. You can turn him into a world beater at this level, but we cannot pretend like this guy has any consistency. And honestly, his 1v1s aren't very good. Like, he's not very polished in that phase of the game. He's just talented. He's really like a molding ball of clay right now where, you know, theoretically you could turn him into a fantastic player and somebody that really ends up taking over the league. But I saw a lot of people being like, well, Knock Knocko's got to be on a top team. Did no one watch game number 1? Like, this guy got slammed, and I get that Kana's really good, but this is not an isolated experience for Knock Knocko. In the same series, he can have a game where he looks fantastic against K-Corp, and also in game 1 looks like a player that shouldn't even be in the LEC. Those both exist right now within Knock Knocko, and it's why I just can't have the same kind of confidence in him that everybody else does. We've seen players like this not be able to put it together or fall apart on, you know, worse situations. It doesn't really feel like he is a complete package right now. But again, the bones of a phenomenal player are there because the talent is absolutely there. It's all really just about what Vitality turns him into or what happens when he goes to a different organization. Linsauce also had a pretty good week. I know I didn't really talk about him. I probably should have saved the Knock Knocko discourse for last, but Linsauce was also pretty solid here. Again, the big thing for Linsauce this week is the payphone meme, which is very, very funny. But Chayek, to me, like, everyone's talking about Knock Knocko. Chayek is the real, like, budding star on this team in terms of just who I think could actually win the league, and I'm really excited to see that. And then for K-Corp on the other side, mistakes, like mistake after mistake after mistake, and honestly, misplays coming in from this team. The only player who I think is not, like, a part of that discussion is Kana on the top side, who is still the best player in the LEC. He still was fantastic here, and he was better than Knock Knocko on the other side. He obliterated him in game number 1 in the Rumble into Mbessa matchup. You know, game number 3 was certainly Kana favored. I think another kind of showcase of just why Knock Knocko's not a completed product is Kana just being able to take advantage of him in the Gnar Cassante matchup. And then, you know, the one thing you're looking at is game 2. And yes, like, the Yorick was really strong and the Jace really had no answer in that second game, but I'm not blaming Kana for that. This guy is the only player who's even remotely consistent in the LEC, like, full stop. Like, throughout this entire year, he's the best player in the region. His team just let him down here today. It's hard to win out of top lane, and that really comes down to the two carry roles, Vladi and Kalist, who I think both were bad today. Vladi has quietly been pretty bad for, like, an extended period of time for K-Corp. He's looking like a weak link on the team right now, and I'm not trying to say that that's something that's going to, you know, keep up, but man, like, the bad games continue to pile up. This guy needs to be a top 2 or a top 3 mid laner in order for this team to have the success that they're looking for. I don't know I can fully, with my, like, full chest, say that he is performing like that right now. I need to see more out of Vladi. Chayek was absolutely better here today, and that's the concern, right, is that if a player like Chayek is better than Vladi, that means K-Corp's not a title contender. Like, that genuinely eliminates your opportunity to be that. Kalist also making uncharacteristic mistakes. I think both of them were bad in their losses, but Kalist's problems were a little bit more on display, which is why he's the one who's getting dud of the series here, mostly for the Sivir. I mean, post 28 minutes, you can't be making positioning mistakes like that. He got blown up on the Corki in game number 2 as well. It just wasn't a good series for Kalist. A lot of mental errors, a lot of positioning errors, things that he absolutely has to clean up in order for him to turn into the #1 player in the league like we think he can be. He's shown so many times throughout this split that he can carry KC. It was not the case in this series. Yike wasn't good enough. I think Linsas was allowed too many opportunities in this series. I think Targamas needed to be a bit more active, although I certainly don't think Targamas was the problem in this series. It just kind of came down to the carry duo being worse for K-Corp than it was for Vitality. Vladi and Kalist were not as good as Chayek and Karzi, and that meant Vitality won this series. K-Corp needs to be able to figure that out and move forward because this is not the #1 team, even after their win last week. And for Vitality, this is a very, very big win. Not only does this basically guarantee your spot moving into playoffs, which is huge, but this means, like, are you not just like a top 5 or top 6 team in the LEC on the best day possible? I love mid lane for this team. I think support has been an upgrade. I think jungle has gotten better. Top lane has ridiculous upside, and Karzi on any given day can perform like one of the better AD carries in the league. Vitality have so much going for them. It's all really just about what happens on the day. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here in the LEC in week number 3, and it was kind of a boring one to go out on, quite frankly. It was G2 Esports taking on Team BDS, and G2 is going to pick up the 2-0 victory. They are going to stay undefeated and really take control of the top of their group. G2 looks unstoppable right now. No spoilers for the power rankings, but there is a very real shot that this is just the best team in the LEC, that once again G2 has realized that they're not going to go an entire calendar year without picking up some sort of domestic trophy, and they are really turning it on now that they have figured things out. Broken Blade is pulling out a bunch of stuff on the top side. He pulls out the Kled and not the Renekton, the Rek'Sai earlier on in the week. Here's the Dr. Mundo in game number 2, and let me tell you, Mundo went where he pleased in this second game because he was absolutely everywhere. For BDS, it kind of feels like this is the worst version of them throughout this year, and I would say that, but this is already a team that underperformed in the spring split, and it feels like they're on pace to do that again here in summer. This is not a top 6 team right now in the LEC. Honestly, they're not even close. I thought players like Rooster and, Bukata would be able to upgrade or at least increase the consistency of what this team was offering, because players like Irrelevant and 113 were so inconsistent for this team. But if anything, it's not changed at all. Like, I think this team has gotten worse in a couple of key areas, which we'll go ahead and talk about. Player of the series is obviously going to Broken Blade on the top side. How do you watch this Mundo game in game 2 and not give him player of the series? It just kind of is what it is. At some point, BDS completely gave up. Paris, who had a terrible series on, multiple hook champions, ended up just saying, screw it, who cares, at the end of game 2 and hooking the Mundo into the rest of his team and just completely ending the game on the spot. Broken Blade was an absolute monster. There was no way to be able to stop that champion in game number 2, and he had a phenomenal week just in general. Again, it feels like he is peaking at the exact right time for G2. I have been very loudly questioning Broken Blade throughout 2025, and I'm certainly not taking back any of that criticism. Go watch him at MSI, go watch him in the spring split. This guy was not playing up to his own standard throughout a majority of this year, but here you go. This is the Broken Blade that needed to show up towards the end of the year, that was going to give G2 the advantage they needed in order to get over the hump, and right now it's happening. The Cassante also looked great in game 1, by the way. Rooster is not a pushover on the top side, even from what we've seen in the LEC. This guy is still pretty solid, and Broken Blade was certainly better than him in this series. Skewmond also had a phenomenal week. He went deathless in this series on Trundle and on Poppy. Really important for him to be able to keep this kind of form up. The top side has been a bit of a liability at times for G2, especially internationally. If Broken Blade's getting on track, if Skewmond is going to start becoming a much more consistent facilitator on things that aren't Maokai and Sejuani and a lot of these more late game champions, then things are going to work out. Poppy obviously still kind of fills that niche, but Trundle's much more aggressive, and I think he's been awesome at Trundle so far this split. Caps continues to have this dominance over Nuke that is unexplained. Nuke's kryptonite has always been Caps, regardless of whether or not he's in good or bad form. It just always is what it is, and even Hansama and Labrav are starting to play well. Still not fully on board with them because they don't really have to do all that much right now with how well the top side side of the map is playing, but at some point you do have to start congratulating Hansama for being a KDA warrior for G2, so I'm going to lock into that. Also, Lebrov looking way better than his replacement in Paris on the other side of this matchup, so really nice win for G2, really cementing themselves at the top of the LEC, at least for now. And for BDS on the other side, this team has so many problems and so many flaws right now, it's really difficult to even dive into it. If the bottom of the LEC wasn't so packed, I would say that they are a bottom 3 team. Hard for me to really lock in on that because of the bottom 3 being quite obvious, at least in my opinion at the current moment. But, bottom 4 is certainly, looking realistic for BDS right now. And a lot of that just has to do with the fact that Paris has never found his footing here in the LEC. Once again, he's going to get dead of the series. Hasn't gotten any of these so far across the summer split, but this is something he's not unfamiliar with across 2025. I had such high expectations for Paris. I was such a fan of his game coming out of the LFL. I really did think he was going to be the rookie that came in and really elevated his team in the same kind of way that we've seen from other rookies. I thought out of him and Skewmond, I liked him more, like individually as a player. I really did think he was that good, but unfortunately, it's just not working out. He's really not been good this year. Him and Ice do not have very good chemistry together, and I think that's starting to come out once again. Ice felt like he was starting to find his footing again in the spring split because it became a hyper carry meta, and especially now in summer, hyper carries are like in full force back. Yunara has been released, Aphelios and Jinx and, Sivir, and all of these champions are starting to get more play. Zaya, Corki, like a lot of these late game carries are starting to get more play, and yet Ice, in a meta that should suit him absolutely perfectly, has regressed back to what he was at the beginning of the year when we had a lot of concerns about him. So that's a problem. Nuke, I think, is playing the worst he has in a very long time, and the changes on the top side have not been improvements. Rooster is definitely better than Irrelevant, but he's not good enough to be able to 1v9 carry this team, as we've talked about for a lot of top laners up until this point in the LEC, and Bukata is honestly looking like a downgrade. I liked 113, and I liked the fact that he would at least try to make plays for this team. He had a ton of terrible games, but in their wins, he often looked really good. Bukata just doesn't even have the good games. He's too stable of a carry, and he doesn't really have that X factor about him, and they spent a ton of money to bring him in to try to elevate this team. It's just not working out. This is a bad BDS team, and unfortunately, despite all of their efforts to try to get better, and one thing I don't want to complain about is I don't want to complain about the team attempting to get better, bringing in Rooster. Maybe you can criticize the Bukata move, but they spent money because they felt like they could be a team that actually competed here, and I'm never going to fault an org for trying to win. That's what the job is. You should try to win. Just because it didn't work out doesn't mean we should point and laugh. It's always been the stupidest trend in LoL esports is, oh, team built a team they thought could win, and it didn't. Let's point and laugh at them. Like, obviously, some teams do that in dumb ways. Like, I would point and laugh at SK because I think, their roster on paper looked bad, but I'm not going to point and laugh at a team that tried their best to build a team and it didn't work out. It just seems to not be working out for BDS. And for G2 on the other side, this team is peaking at the exact right time. This is the best league they've played all year. But how much does it really matter? Like, the rest of the LEC is so inconsistent, it's hard to even get a read on what G2's form actually is right now. This is certainly not the best version of G2 we've seen over the past couple of years, but it might be the best version so far in 2025. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC overview and analysis of week number 3. Up on the screen, the updated standings after 3 weeks of action here in the LEC. And we've already got quite a bit locked with only one more regular season week remaining, week 4 being the last before we cut down to 8 teams from 10. We have a pretty good idea of where a lot of these teams are sitting, and that is color coordinated right now in terms of these groups. Of course, in blue will be teams that have guaranteed themselves top 2 at the very least in their group. That means they've guaranteed themselves upper bracket going into playoffs. Green means that they've guaranteed themselves playoffs at the very least, but still have to fight it out in order to try and get into that upper section. Of course, red would indicate that a team has officially been eliminated, and that is true for Group A, which is all but decided right now, as you can see, but you can reflect how I personally view a lot of these teams and their projections moving forward in the power rankings column, immediately to the right of every single team. Change is going to be how they have changed from last week to this week, so we can go over risers and fallers in terms of, what I'm thinking about these teams, and there's quite a lot to talk about in that regard. Moving up to number 1, G2 Esports. Right now, it just feels like they're on the warpath to try to get their domestic title that they've not missed out on in a calendar year in a very, very long time. And so G2 definitely feel like they want to be pushing for that. I believe it was 2021, the last time that G2 missed out on a domestic title in a calendar year. I might be wrong about that. Like the Mad Lions year where they won, back-to-back titles. I believe that was the last time that was the case, but let me know down in the comments if I'm incorrect on that. I'm just kind of shooting off the dome when it comes to that that. But right now, it just feels like G2 Magic is kicking in full force, and they are the team to beat, especially because they're the only undefeated team left in the LEC. K-Corp is going to drop to number 2 after their disappointing loss to Vitality. As much as I do like how Vitality played, I still think K-Corp is a very good team, and I think they still have a lot going for them, but the inconsistency of this team can no longer be denied. While I do think they're better than Koi and Fnatic, right now G2 is significantly better in terms of their execution, and I'm still worried about the results we got in the playoffs last split in spring when this team really kind of shit the bed. So they moved down to 2. Koi's going to stay at 3. They feel fine, but losing to K-Corp last week definitely still puts a bit of doubt in my mind. And Fnatic definitely at 4. Talked about it last week, but I was like, oh, they're going up against G2. If they can hold their own, maybe they move up. They didn't. They're the 4th best team in the LEC still, but everything else is kind of up in flux. I'm going to keep Giant X at 5, despite the fact that they're sitting at 1 and 2. Their 2 losses are to K-Corp and Koi, which is a perfectly fine place for them to be, depending on how they perform in the final, couple, I guess, weeks of the summer split, not just the regular season, but the playoffs as well. I think you could be looking at the best of the rest type of team. I still really believe in that bot lane, but Vitality very much catching up. They're going to move up 2 slots to number 6. If you wanted them at number 5, I'm really not going to push back too much. I think GX and Vitality are clearly number 5 and 6 in the power rankings. And then moving down, BDS is going to move down to 7. I still think they're better than the bottom 3, but not by a lot. This team has a lot of problems going for them, and I think they're playing some of the worst league they have in a very long time. And then bottom 3, like I said, pretty locked in. Somehow, someway, SK Gaming are jumping up to number 8 in my power rankings with that win over Team Heretics. They're just kind of better than Heretics right now, which is not expected. They were better than them in that series, and I think, honestly, I project Heretics to be worse moving forward if they continue to play the way that they have so far. This split, their veterans are now really underperforming. They fall down to number 9, and they're a team that's in a really bad place, sitting at 0-3, and quite frankly, looking like they're going to be the first team eliminated from Group B and bottom 2 in the LEC in the summer split. But Na'Vi, unfortunately, the new org coming in, didn't really have a lot of resources to work with in terms of building a roster in a short amount of time. It's why you don't often see organization swaps mid-year, but you can see it in the results. 0-3, 10th in the power rankings. They're the worst team in the LEC, and I don't think it's particularly close. But let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comment section below. Very curious to know where you land on my power rankings and where your own end up, kind of pushing in each direction. But let's go ahead and move on to my player of the week and my dud of the week here for week number 3. Player of the week was super easy for me. It's going to go to Broken Blade, the top laner for G2. What a week for Broken Blade. 3 off-meta picks, at least in some way, shape, or form, and 3 very successful games, 4 very successful games. Just one of them was on a pretty common pick, so we're going to ignore it. But Kled and Rek'Sai against Fnatic, Mundo in game 2 against BDS, and all 3 of those games end up looking incredibly fantastic. Broken Blade was the best and most valuable player in the LEC this week, and it wasn't particularly close. The only player in the league that I think even came close to that kind of accolade was Chayek, the mid laner for Team Vitality, who's my number 1 honorable mention. What a week for Chayek. He's right now the best player on Vitality. He's really emerging as one of the more fun mid laners to watch in the region, and I know he doesn't have the most carry-oriented playstyle. He's not the guy who's going to be picking a Kali or Silas and taking over games, but his Orianna is just as good as anybody's in the league. His Annie, his, facilitators, Talia, like they're as good as anybody else's in the LEC right now, and he really is pushing Vitality forward. I think he's the biggest positive on that team, and I think at this point he's undervalued. He's underrated by the community as a whole. He was phenomenal across this week. And then Skeens is going to be my other honorable mention. Shout out SK Gaming for picking up that win against Heretics. Skeens was really good in that series. If he's going to be able to hang on to that kind of performance, maybe SK is going to be better than we thought. So Chayek and Skeens are going to be my honorable mentions. And then my dud of the week, unfortunately, it's going to go to Thager, the jungler for Na'Vi. This should not come as a surprise. He had a terrible week. I think Na'Vi in general is just not a particularly good team. And, depending on what happens, I think it might be, unfortunately, Thager's last time in the LEC. And that feels like a sad thing to say. It's like, oh, that's a really unfortunate way to talk about a player. But just with your replacement already lined up, the organization having already signed a player to take your spot going into next year, it's just got to be such a demoralizing experience. And perhaps that's why he's not performing all that well. This is a pretty, rough situation, I would say, for anybody to come into and kind of know that you're not going to have this spot going into 2026, regardless of how well you play. But unfortunately, Thager kind of playing himself out of a job in a couple of ways. So Thager is dud of the week, and Broken Blade is going to be my player of the week. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're going to be covering the rest of the LEC, both regular season and playoffs, on this channel as we get closer and closer to the World Championships. But we cover all 3 of the other major regions as well. So LTA North, LCK, and LPL every single week as well. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. I'm still casting for LPL English every single week, basically. The links to that are going to be down in the description below. The YouTube, the Twitch, go ahead and follow if you are curious in the LPL or just want to see my thoughts and opinions on casting a game live. You can check that out on either website that you prefer. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all